So what I'm doing here is I'm just removing some of the loose bark, just with a chisel. I mean, the key is to have a really sharp chisel here, just makes your life so much easier. But the reason behind doing this is because when you pour the epoxy in between the two slabs, it'll adhere to obviously what it's ever in contact with. So if that loose bark is not got a good contact, well, it's not stuck properly to the slab, then what will happen later on in the day is when you come to use the table, it'll start to split and come away from the main body of the slab, and so it'll look quite horrendous. So what I'm using here is like a shaping tool as well, just to take off smooth out and take off some more of that kind of loose bark that's attached to the Sequoia, just to make sure that the table's going to last the length of time and not have any issues further down the line. The tricky bit is going around about the knots and just making sure you get the loose items in there. Also in this particular case, I forgot to film it, but there are a couple areas where we've got some kind of rot that's maybe went in and dried out, so I had to kind of chip in there with the chisel and just scrape a lot of that loose item, that loose bark, and some of the rotted wood that had dried out. Obviously having a big workbench makes this a hell of a lot easier, and PPE is your friend, especially a dust mask, because there's a lot of dust that comes kicking off of this particular process. So here, what I'm doing, I'm just roughly shaping the slabs into a 90-degree shape for the table. So what I've done is I've laid the two slabs out together to get an idea of what the end table is going to look like, and then what I want to do is just square off the ends, just so I've got a 90-degree edge. Now later on, I will recut the edges once the epoxy's been poured, but at least this gives us a approximate size in order to put it into the mould. Now one thing I probably would do differently here is the slabs that I got were two different sizes, so one was about just over 3 inches thick, and the other one was around about 2, so there was a bit of a mix match. So I probably would have planed these down to the same size before doing this to make it a little bit easier. I could do both at the same time, but it's not a huge issue. Obviously plunge saws makes it a lot easier. So this is the slab flattening process. So I'm only going to show you the one video, but this definitely takes a while. So I've made a little jig here just to make the process a bit easier, and I'll probably mount it onto a table at a later date, but because my floor is flat, the process works perfectly. And this is me just making the mould. So just making it out of MDF, and then you get this special tape. It's like packing tape that you can put on the mould to help the mould release from the frame, which means you could potentially reuse the mould as well, so although maybe not suggested. So here I'm just measuring it up. Now I forgot to film the process of putting the epoxy on the edges, so this is just some clear quick set epoxy. You just put it on the edge it's going to be, the main pour is going to go in against, just to help adhesion and also minimise bubbles. So within the frame as well, I did it all with box joints. I find that's the easiest way. So you put the slabs in, get your length right, just leave a little bit of clearance, and then you just clamp it all together, put in silicone just to stop the epoxy from flowing out. You can't have too many connections, so you can see the amount of kind of box joints that I've put in there just to make sure that it's all screwed together, as well as putting in the ends. I think because of the epoxy being so expensive, you really can't skimp on your mould, because you don't want £500–600 worth of epoxy being all over your shed floor. And then black silicone just around the edges again makes it easier to see when it comes to separating the mould of what's the silicone. And then I just smooth it off with my finger with a bit of water. And then what I'm doing here is putting in some mould release spray. And again some black silicone along the bottom of the slab just to stop the epoxy flowing underneath. Makes your life a little bit easier later on. And then install the slabs, just getting ready for the pour. So again, I've raised the mould off the floor just so I can put some clamps on to stop the slabs floating when it comes to pouring in your epoxy. And then also use a glue gun to basically make a little dam that runs along the edge of the slabs. This stops the epoxy flowing over the top. So you'll kind of see me doing here. Now I did break the glue gun halfway through, so I had to go out and buy another one, but you get the idea here. So you just want to seal the ends and seal along the top. Is the initial pour, so you'll use a quick cast, quick drying thin pour epoxy, just initial, just to pour along the bottom. Again, this just helps with the kind of adhesion of the slabs, and also helps to minimise bubbles, because you don't want bubbles in the middle of your table, so you can't stir too much. And then make sure you note down your ratios of the colouring that you're putting in. I would just put the pour. So you just leave this for, I think this one was 48 hours, and then it'd be hard ready for the next pour. And then make sure you clean your equipment. I just use some clutch cleaner, and then just give it a quick run over with the blowtorch just to get rid of any bubbles. You'll probably need to come back, every hour for a couple hours with this one. Then you're mixing up the main pour. So I usually use scales. Now I wouldn't use these scales again. It was the only ones I had at hand. Were absolute nightmare for turning on and off again. But just to get your ratios of the epoxy together. So that's me just mixing in the pigments. And if you're mixing this amount of ratio, I've got a timer on the wall just so I know how long I've been mixing for, because it does take quite a long time. I think I was mixing for approximately 10 or 15 minutes. The last thing you want to do is not mix it properly, and then you've got soft bits in the middle of your table. And then again, epoxy is not cheap, so it's definitely probably one of, if not the most expensive parts of when it comes to creating the table, out with obviously your labour. And then pour slowly from either end. Again, before this you need to make sure that your mould is completely level, because epoxy will just flow and you'll end up overflowing at one end. So here I had a little bit too much epoxy in there and it was threatening to kind of overspill. So I just went round and added a little extra layer of the glue dam, just to make sure it didn't spill over. And again, just going round and popping the bubbles. And I think I came back every hour for the next 4 hours, and I just left that for 10 days. So this is the demoulding process. So it's just a case of going round, and you just get a little wedge, chip in underneath the seal. The silicone will still stick to the tape, but it's nowhere near as bad as what it would be if you put it directly on the tape. So you can see underneath there, that first layer of silicone stopped the epoxy from flowing out underneath. Just makes it a little bit easier when it comes to cleaning up the table. There is a bit of time involved, obviously scraping off all the silicone, but trust me, it's definitely worth it. If you want to leave it overnight, I always just put like a tarp over the top just to stop the moisture getting in and warping your table. It's just me chipping out the glue, and then the slab flattening process. So you need to do this on both sides, going back and forth, but I'll just show you one side here. This is definitely one of the more laborious, and this is the bit I hate. But it's got to be done. Now I wasn't wearing a mask here for some reason. I think I possibly would go and put one on. Yeah, there we go. Safety first. So hearing protection and breathing apparatus is definitely a must for this part, just with all the dust that comes off there. It's definitely a messy task. This little runner I did made for the router, it does the job. This works perfectly. It gets your tables flat. So you need to do this on both sides. And you'll probably go through a router bit per table, I would say. I did use a carve-out router bit on this one, but it was a little bit dull by the end. So you need a sharpen. And now the next stage is sanding. So you will have had about, I don't know, 15, 16 hours of sanding probably, accumulation over quite a few days. So I always just start off with a belt sander, starting really rough, down to about 60 grit, just to get the rough of the flattening marks out. You'll find that even with the shot back connected up to the belt sander, it does clog up quite quickly. Now I would never finish a table with a belt sander, always use a rotary sander, but it does the initial job. So I just go up through the grit here up to about 150 from 60. So this is definitely the most time consuming part of the process, but without this the table would not look very good. It's the gear there, so you definitely need headphones with good podcast and a breathing mask. I find I just get into a zone, and as time goes by, as long as you're listening to something good, it's not too bad a process. I think I was ordering more sanding discs here. Yeah, it's me starting on the rotary one. So I think this is on about times 60 speed, so it gives you an idea of the how long I take going back and forth from one pass. Now when it comes to sanding, I go right up through the git, so starting that down at about 60 with the rotary, going up to 80, 100, 120, 150, 180, 200, 220, 250, 300, right up to about 800 grit, and then I'm moving on to the car polisher, which you'll see later on as well. Now you will need to change the disc quite often. You want to either clean them out or change them, otherwise you'll end up with pigtails, especially on your epoxy. So what I've done here is there's been little imperfections in the wood and in the epoxy. So I'm just filling that in with a 2-part glue, just in order to seal those holes, and then re-sand them back down again to get a good finish. So this is me just squaring off the table now using the plunge saw. You can use a circular saw here if you don't have a plunge saw, but just measure twice, make sure you've got the right size. So if you draw a grid on the table, it makes the sanding process, just to make sure you've not missed any parts, make sure all the pencil markers is clear, and you just go back over and do that for each of the grits going up. I'd probably do one grit twice, especially on maybe 100, 120. I'll go over the table numerous times, several times, before moving up the grits. I'm not including all the video of the sanding because it really is a very long process. So you want to do the bottom and you want to do the top. The bottom I would normally go up to about 300 because no one's really going to see the bottom. So here I'm making the supports, just like the C channels. So these are metal supports that are embedded into the table that will help stop the table from warping, which means you can take a lot of abuse. So you can see the position I'm putting in here, just scribing them out. And then what I would use here, I would just use a router. I think it was a 1/4" bit router I used for this one. You want to make sure it's a nice snug fit along the width, but you've got to make sure you leave extra clearance on the length for expansion. Again, it kind of probably do the opposite of what you wanted. If you didn't leave enough clearance, you would end up with some warping. So the initial cut, just get it flush so that the top of the channel is going to be flush with the bottom of the table, and then I want to just kind of mill in 3 grooves at either end in order to insert the channel. You can see I'm reusing part of the mould here just to make a guide for the router in order to get a straight edge. You could make a different jig in order to do this, but this works fine. I think it was a little bit tight, so what I ended up using was I actually just used a steel rule just to extend the width just a little bit. Okay, and then again just repeating the process on the other side. And when I built the shed, I put in LED lights in the top, but I end up using a little spotlight in order to get a bit of better vision, because it can sometimes be a bit difficult to see exactly what you're doing, especially when it comes to finishing the edges. And then that was me just finishing the bottom just with the router, just with a form bit, just to put a little chamfer on the corners. and then I'm just installing these drilled studs. I wouldn't screw directly into the table. These studs make it just a bit more secure and a lot better, in my opinion. And then I'm just putting some finish within the channels, and then I'm just making sure everything's okay with the boss, and then just putting it to work a little bit. And then I'm just installing the bolts with the washers here. And then back to sanding the top, just going off the grit. So I'm just making sure I'm doing the edges as well. Again, same thing with the top. If you're going up through the grits, you need to make sure you go up through the grits on the sides as well. Just putting the grid pattern on the top. See, you've got to remember to change the pads for doing the epoxy in the middle, because it does get choked up quite quickly, even with it being attached to the shop vac. And then again, I found a couple more imperfections in the table I wasn't quite happy with, so I just went back through and just filled it with that glue that I was talking about, and then just going back through and smoothing out them. Now I did go and buy a little Makita Orbiter sander here. Now it was the cheaper of the Makita range, and it's fine, probably going up to maybe like up to about 220, 300 grit, but I went high, I went up to 800 with it, sanding, especially on the epoxy in the middle, and what I found was it was leaving pigtails even though I was cleaning the discs. So I had to go back down the grits and repeat again using the DeWalt, so a bit of a lesson learned there. I guess that this sander is perfect for the odd job here and there, but when it comes to the high end finishing, probably need a slightly better sander. I mean, maybe I wasn't using it properly, but I've used it like I've used the DeWalt, and it definitely made a difference. The DeWalt was a lot better. Again, I think I went in with the glue again here and just filled in a few more holes. You always got to have the compulsory foam breaks. Again, this is the first video I've made, so if you think I've missed anything or anything else I should go through, then please let me know. Just wanted to give an idea of the process. So you can see it really pop here just when I'm starting to clean things up. Just look a lot better. I was just making sure I'd missed anything, give us an idea of where I was. And again, just going up through the grits. I mean, as I did touch on, I did have to go and repeat this whole process again, just due to some of the marks that were left. Mainly, again, on the epoxy. So the Sequoia was actually really quite an easy wood to work with. It is a soft wood, so you do have to be a little bit careful. But so what I was doing here was I was water popping in between the higher grits. What this does is just kind of get some of the end grain, it stands up, so it makes it a little bit smoother, because quite often what can happen is you put your finish on and the wood reacts and it becomes rough just with the way that I don't know the full science behind it, but basically it creates a rough surface. So by putting the water on it, it kind of minimises this happening when it comes to the finish, and it means you've got a much smoother surface. So you just do a little water pop in between each finish. and if you want to dry it off quicker, you can just use a heat gun or a blowtorch. Just probably at an angle to the table, so you're not burning the table, but if you keep it moving quickly, it can just dry off the surface quick enough and it doesn't harm the table at all. An air gun, if you have one, is also super handy just for getting rid of the dust that builds up. One thing I would also say is never skip a grit. Always go up through the stages. It makes a huge difference. Now before it comes to sanding, I always just go over with a bit of white spirit just to remove a lot of the grease. And in here what I'm using is an orbital car polish with 1050 polishing compound. Make sure you don't get one with any of the inbuilt maybe colouring or anything in it. And then after this I'm going up to 2000 and then on to 3000 in order to get that mirror finish. Now what I'm not showing here is each time you're using that polish you want to go over several tables lengthwise across the way, especially across the epoxy, just to build up that finish. So it's not just a once over, you do have to do it several times for each of the various grits. And again, just going through, making sure I've not missed anything, picking out any imperfections, go up through the polisher, and then finally the good bit, which it comes to finishing. So I use Rubio Monocoat. It's really good hardware and surface, really easy to use. Mix it in together, apply once, and then wipe off, and you're done. So use a scraper, scrape it all out, and then use it's basically like a really light emery. You get it with the Rubio, just to apply it. So, and you're just leaving that for 5-10 minutes, and then wiping off the excess. And then I'll leave you with just a few photos of the finished article, but I'm really happy with the way this came out, and it looks great in my kitchen.